I'd like to start out by how you got interested in this, because like I said, you've been doing this for a very long time, and you started this when I don't know that many people were considering this even as a field.
Right. Well, actually, the reason I became a doctor was during high school. My grandmother, who used to watch Jack LaLanne with me every afternoon when she took care of me and was a kind of a health food nut, unfortunately fell off a ladder and broke her hip. And at the time, there was no geriatric medicine. This was in the 1970s. And she had all of the bad things that happen after you break a hip when medicine isn't very good in terms of, medical complications and malnutrition and strokes and delirium, and ended up in a nursing home tied down with Haldol. I mean, all of the horror stories that you heard about. So at that time, I was going to be a vet, but I decided I needed to become a doctor. And I actually, decided that I wanted to go into aging, which wasn't a specialty at that time. There was no geriatric medicine specialty. So I went to medical school, and I used to tell my medical school friends I was going to start a geriatric sports medicine clinic, but I didn't even really know what that meant. And everyone thought I was kind of crazy. But I had the good fortune of, after my geriatric fellowship, of moving to Boston to do my first job at Tufts and Harvard, and working in a lab that was run by Bill Evans, who's a kind of a very well-known leader in the field of exercise and sarcopenia, which is a term that was coined by the director of that center, Erwin Rosenberg, in 1986, which meant the loss of skeletal muscle with aging, which no one had really thought of as a disease. We'd heard of osteoporosis and osteopenia, but sarcopenia was not a thing until he, who was a nutritionist, was going around the hospital wards, and he would look, open up the rooms and go into the rooms and lift under the sheets, and he'd see these skinny little legs sticking out, but it was something nobody was talking about, this loss of muscle. So that was the lab that I worked in, and we decided to do a study in a nursing home called Hebrew Rehabilitation Center in Boston, where everybody was pretty much in their late 80s and 90s. And we didn't know really what to do, but we decided to use the exact same paradigm that Delorme had coined in 1945 about progressive resistance training, when he was treating soldiers who had injuries, and decided that having them lift heavy weights was going to be the best way to rehabilitate them. But no one had really done that in medicine before. And so we decided that these people who could, barely walk around the nursing home, that this was the missing secret ingredient, really, was something to treat their muscle strength. And so we did our first studies back there in 1988 and found that we could markedly increase strength and mobility. And we did muscle biopsies, and we could see that little baby muscle cells were forming in their 96-year-old legs. And something that was heresy at the time. People said you couldn't, have any hyperplasia or new muscle cells after childhood or embryonic life, really. So that was kind of the beginning, and we went from there to lots of other clinical diseases that are associated with this loss of muscle. So things like sarcopenia, as well as osteoporosis, heart disease, diabetes, depression, renal failure. Pretty much every chronic disease that you can think about is accompanied by some kind of inflammation that causes you to lose muscle. So very much central to the concept of aging. And so since that time, we've done, lots of clinical trials, and also set up clinical programs to try and insert this into the medical mainstream. I would say it isn't yet in the medical mainstream, except in my clinical practice, but it is certainly something that is a missing ingredient for healthcare, I would say, globally.
Wow. Well, you mentioned heresy, and trying to think back on that time in the 80s. The jogging boom had just kind of started. Maybe the decade earlier, we were well in the throes of the low fat movement, and the no fat kind of area. The food pyramid would come out a few years later. But I'm just thinking, like, this must have been very controversial to do that initial study, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot of skepticism, mostly I would say on the part of the healthcare practitioners, not so much the patients or the residents. So when we went to this nursing home and tried to promote our study for the first time, and We had like a meeting in a seminar room or auditorium, and people came down to hear because it was a place that lots of research was done, affiliated with Harvard, and so they were always used to hearing about new studies that they could participate in. And so I proposed my study, and I said, we're going to do weightlifting, and who wants to join my study? And they kind of looked at me like I was crazy, and I said, well, do you want to live longer? And they looked at me like, we're 90-year-old Holocaust survivors, we're good, and so I said, well, what would make you, want to do this study? And this little man in the front row stood up, and he said, what I would like is I would like to be able to get up in the middle of the night, go to the bathroom by myself without calling the nurse, and come back to my bed. And I said, I can give you that. So that was really the kind of, light bulb moment that, mobility is the key. And, these people don't need to run a marathon. Mostly they need to navigate their, environment around their home and walk to the store and those kinds of things. And the medicines that we give them treat their diseases, but we don't have any medicines for the things that are really core to their quality of life, as you said, which is often frailty, mobility impairment, falls, fear of falling, activity restriction, fatigue. So we don't have drugs for any of those things, right? We have drugs for organs, but not for the thing that is really bothering them. And I'm, as a geriatrician, which is what I am, when people are sent to me for consultation from other doctors, they're very well doctored up with, lots of organ specialists for every part of their body and lots of medications. But I often find that when they walk in the door, no one has really seen them. The thing that strikes me, absolutely first when I see them is this frailty often, but it isn't on their list of diagnoses. It isn't, there's no drug for it. No one has really, called it. And that's what we treat. And we still, we treat their medical diseases because a lot of them contribute to frailty and lots of drug side effects contribute to frailty, but none of them treat it. And so we deliver the treatment, which is high intensity progressive resistance training, often with balance training added. We don't prescribe walking or aerobic exercise initially for most of them. We do later on, but the thing that kind of is very striking is that if you look at a young person who's not walking or running, they don't want to or they don't have time. They can, but they just don't want to. Whereas an older person who isn't walking, it's not really lack of desire, it's really lack of capacity. So it's very much like a baby almost who, desire is fine. You don't have to pat them on the back and say, oh, really, really should be exercising. You have to give them capacity, which is generally growing up. Whereas in an older adult, it's kind of the same again. They don't not want to walk. It's just that they have lost the reserves that allow them to get out of a chair safely and stand up and walk across the room. And we found that even in that first study we did, we just did seated strength training, no balance training, nothing else. And they began walking around the nursing home 35% more with activity monitors that we put on their ankles compared to the people in the control group who were getting the typical kind of, gentle exercise, throwing a beach ball around class in the nursing home. So that's really so we focus on the prime movers, if you will, of mobility, and then often find that other things emanate from that. And it's not just physical. We've done studies with clinical depression and with cognitive impairment and early dementia and late dementia, in fact. And we see very strong neuropsychological changes as well. And it's not, not so much of a mystery because the head is connected to the body, and basically the anabolic factors that or the, muscle growth factors that emanate when you contract a muscle do go to the brain, and the neurons have the same requirements as muscle cells in terms of liking anabolic hormones and not liking catabolic or destructive hormones or insulin, inflammatory mediators, things like that. So exercise is very anti-inflammatory in that way. It kind of shifts you from this catabolic to an anabolic milieu, which is what you want. And so without, giving somebody testosterone or androgens in any form, you can induce those same anabolic changes with the weightlifting exercise, and sometimes accompanied by, protein and things if they're malnourished. But, that's the key that's missing from the drugs that we give, unfortunately.